The chime of the bell beckons us into a sacred time. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston, where we widen love's circle by honoring the inherent worth and dignity of all, by advancing justice and religious pluralism, and by inspiring an ever-deepening spirituality. We extend a heartfelt and inclusive invitation to join us in meaningful worship and in service to the world. We greet all those who join us this morning, those here in our sanctuary, all of our many online viewers, así como el creciente número de participantes bilingües que nos acompañan desde sus hogares. Please make note that the responses that were once found in your order of service are now on laminated cards. And while mask wearing in the sanctuary is currently optional, you are encouraged to continue to wear your mask if you are more comfortable doing so. And especially if you're visiting us today, we hope you'll join us in Channing Hall after the service for coffee and conversation. Now please join Dr. Rock and the choir, and raise your voice in song for our first hymn.
Good morning. I invite you to open your teal hymnals to number 1024, When the Spirit Says Do. Please rise in body or in spirit and join together as we sing.
We gather this morning with words inspired by outgoing president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. We gather from separate homes, from separate places, to join together in a community of radical joy and acceptance. We gather to say welcome, to tell each other that each of us, that all of us has a place in this congregation, in this city, and in this world. We gather to say that the migrant, the undocumented, the refugee is welcome here. We gather to say that whatever your religious tradition, whether you are Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Jew, atheist, Buddhist, humanist, atheist, you are welcome here. We gather to say that if you are gay or straight, woman or man, transgender or queer, you are welcome here. We gather to say that if you have a disability, visible or invisible, you are welcome here. We gather in this community to proclaim that all are welcome, that love is more powerful than hate, that there is hope for justice, and that it is good to be together. Come, friends, let us worship.
Now let us recite together our congregational covenant. It is located on the back of your order of service. Love is the spirit of our congregation. Service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek truth in love, and to encourage one another. Thus do we covenant.
The eighth principle calls on us to build the beloved community through inclusion and accountability, dismantling racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Throughout the month of May, we'll be sharing member testimonials about why adopting the eighth principle during the annual meeting on June 4th is so important to them.
Hi, my name is Leslie Morrison. My family and I have attended FIRSTUU since 2018. I grew up colorblind. You know, the terminology used to discredit and minimize stories from people who don't appear to have white skin. My colorblindness meant that I didn't think twice about being open to all ethnicities when we started the adoption process. Color obviously didn't matter. I was wrong. Becoming a mother to a black child 8 years ago ripped off the blinders I'd proudly worn as a good white person for years. Millie was not represented in the books, toys, or artwork in our home. I quickly began to notice when she was the only person of color in a room. People were constantly touching her hair and being far more critical of her than of my other two biological children. I saw the news differently. I noticed comments I'd never given a second thought to before. I realized I was in over my head and I turned to Black authors. I was well on the path of anti-racism when the racial unrest in 2020 began. That said, I was still not quite prepared for the white fragility Robin DiAngelo spoke about in her book and at General Assembly in 2019. I share all of this because some of you may think the eighth principle is unnecessary. You may think beloved community and dismantling racism are implied in the other 7 principles. My daughter and every single Black, Indigenous person of color deserves to be in a community they know is inclusive and is doing everything they can to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Privilege is thinking something isn't a problem because it's not your problem. Adopting the eighth principle ensures that everyone who walks into our church knows that their problems and experiences will not be dismissed. Thank you so much for considering the eighth principle. It means a lot to me and my family.
That was really lovely. Thank you. Now is the time when we acknowledge that we've got young people in the sanctuary because they're going to go do some really cool activities with the amazing Carol. So I just want you to know that you're an important part of this. Thank you. Because she is. I just want you all to know what an important part of the church you are and how much we love you. And we will show that because all the people who you leave behind are going to sing as you go, which is on the laminated card. This is the time during the service when we pause for contemplation. Our lives may be hectic, we may often be distracted, so with intention and care, we carve out this time to silence our minds and hearts. This is a time that some call meditation and others name prayer. Breathe with me the breath of life. Breathe in for loving, for acceptance, and with a sense of calm. Breathe out the sorrow, the division, and the stress. Inhale as we share this interwoven, intricate web of affinity. Exhale as we feel one another's presence. Breathe with me as we gather to do the holy work of kinship and support. Open your mind, open your heart. God of many names, holy, unnameable one, holy, unknowable one, mystery beyond all our naming. In this sacred time and in the midst of this community in covenant, we bring hearts seeking hope. We gather together to not only gather strength from the ineffable that is greater than ourselves, but create hope from our shared love, values, and intentions. As each day brings news that could easily cause despair, may the light of hope guard our hearts from the blight of cynicism and bitterness. Because ours is not the only gauge of time, help us to persevere, to continue to make the choices that move our world toward the beacons of sustainability and justice. even if we do not personally cross that mountain. We pray in the names of all those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten. We pray in the names of all helpers of humankind. Amen. We pause now together to lift up that which sits heavy and light on our hearts. Ketty Outlaw had surgery Tuesday, and we hold her in our hearts as she recovers and begins rehab. The father of K.C. Panjwani passed away Wednesday night, and we offer condolences to his entire family. Longtime member Cynthia Conwell passed away early Thursday morning. A memorial service will be planned. Our hearts are with Wendy Van Sickle and all those close to Cynthia. A small service to remember Ken Walker, who passed away in February, will be held Saturday, June 10th at 11 a.m. in the church memorial garden. And the memorial service for one-time member and peace activist Lee Lowe will be held at the church on July 15th at 2 p.m. And we now turn to a practice inspired by African, indigenous, and pagan traditions. We say aloud or bring to mind those who we wish to be held by the loving embrace of this community. They are part of the great cloud of witness and memory, and we will, even if we do not know their names, hold them in our hearts. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us remember the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. We pause in awe and wonder of the beauty, diversity, and mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite each of you to enter into a time of silent prayer, meditation, or reflection.
Each week, our morning offering is shared with an organization that shares our Unitarian Universalist values and through which we may live out our principles in the world. Today, our shared offering will help to support Planned Parenthood of the Gulf Coast. Planned Parenthood is America's most trusted provider of reproductive health care. To tell us more about Planned Parenthood is our longtime member, Mary Cook.
Good morning. Planned Parenthood is a nonprofit organization that is one of 600 affiliates throughout the United States and other countries that provide reproductive care. As you know, Planned Parenthood is under siege in many states, including our own, and puts the provision of health care for women and men needing this kind of service at risk. I'd also like to remind you that our congregation is a reproductive justice congregation. We voted on that several years ago, and we followed the guidelines of the UUA, which basically means we support individuals' choices for reproduction, whatever they may be, whatever. So I urge you to support Planned Parenthood and to give generously, and the shared offering will now be taken. Thank you.
Please join with me in the words to dedicate our offering found in your laminated pew card. To the work of this church, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives, and these our offerings.
Our first reading this morning is titled The Change, and it's by Matthew P. Taylor. I can feel the change coming, like growing pains. I feel the change in my bones, pulling me, stretching me, forming me into the true I am. Can you feel it? The change in our bodies as we adapt, grow, change, the weight shifting and molding to fit, This evolving body that we are in, guided by faith that this too will pass. We can survive this because our ancestors survived. Can you feel them in your DNA? You, a mixture of their particles that was molded to fit your spirit, change and shift, mold and grow. Yet, in some ways, we stay the same. There ends the first reading.
The second reading this morning is from Congregational Polity by Natalie Fenimore. Our congregationalism gives authority and responsibility to each member of our congregations and communities, and it is a proclamation of their worth and dignity. It says, "You are needed. You are valuable. You are central to the process of making a Unitarian Universalist religious community." The power of the individual member of our congregational and covenanted community is best held with humility. We are asked to recognize that our power is shared with other individuals and with those called as partners in leadership within our communities. This is the dance of congregationalism, sharing leadership, recognizing when individuals are best in position to lead or to move back, and making space for new ideas, change, and transformation. Congregationalism asks us to struggle as individuals and a body in order to determine the future of our faith. And while Unitarian Universalists valued democracy, it is best not seen as democracy in the purely political sense. This is not about winning by vote alone, but rather as honoring the voices of all and listening to the call of conscience. Thus ends the second reading.
And now I invite you to take a look at the screen for the text for the next hymn. Please rise in body or spirit and join together as we sing.
Would you harbor me? Would I harbor you?
Next month, at our annual congregational meeting, we'll be voting on whether or not to adopt the proposed 8th principle as a congregation. The principle was developed by 2 Unitarian Universalist lay people, Paula Cole-Jones, who led a workshop yesterday that some of you attended, is a lifelong member of All Souls Unitarian in Washington, D.C. Bruce Pollock Johnson is a longtime member of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Mount Airy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The text, which Leslie Morrison referred to earlier in her testimonial, and which Charles Johnson and Earl and Georgette Dredge spoke about earlier in the month, reads, "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions." This morning, I want to talk with you about why I'm in favor of our congregation voting to adopt this principle. As a way of approaching the potential importance of the principle for our life together, I want to recall an episode in our own community's history. A few months ago, you might remember that I shared with you the story around the congregation's 1954 decision to desegregate. In case you were not here that Sunday, or you appreciate a refresher, it's worth recalling the history. 3 weeks after the United States Supreme Court made its decision in Browden v. Board of Education to overturn legalized school segregation, the members of the then First Unitarian Church of Houston voted to become the first historically white religious community to welcome people of all races into its membership and for worship. It was not, as I told you then, a decision without dust and heat. It put First Unitarian Universalist on the leading edge of racial justice. Some 10% of the membership resigned, deciding that they were more committed to white supremacy and segregation than they were to the principles of Unitarianism. Many of them sent nasty letters to the minister at the time. His name was the Reverend Horace Westwood. They accused him of following the communist line and turning the church into an atheistic organization with its primary emphasis on left-wing politics. Reviewing the history in the congregational archives, I found a story that the Reverend Bob Shibley, senior minister here from 1982 to 2002, liked to tell about those times. On more than one occasion, he shared from this pulpit the account offered to him about the first African-American member of the church. His name was Lavenel Henderson. His name is likely familiar to those of you who are longtime members. He was active in the congregation from the 1950s until the end of his life in the late 1990s. In 1954, Lavenel came to Houston to take up a job as a professor at Texas Southern University. A stranger in town, he decided, like so many people who move to Houston, to seek out a religious community. Now, our congregation was not his first choice. The Sunday before he visited us, he visited one of the other churches along Main Street. Now, I have no idea whether it was First Presbyterian or St. Matthew's or St. Paul's. It doesn't matter, and it's probably better, in all honesty, that we don't know. For whatever church it was, the ushers pulled a move prefiguring George Wallace's arch segregationist policies a few years later. They stood in the doorway of the sanctuary and prevented him from entering. The next Sunday, Lavenel decided to see if he would be more receptive, or the First Unitarian Church would be more receptive of him. So no one stopped him when he walked up the steps of the Fannin entrance, and no one stopped him when he came through the sanctuary doors. So he slipped in and found a seat someplace in the back pews, where visitors still like to reside so they can slip out if the sermon is a little bit too boring. In one of their conversations, Lavenal recounted to Reverend Shibley what happened next. There was a young white couple sitting a handful of pews in front of him, and they turned around and looked at him. Then they got up and sat down on either side of him. Lavenal told Reverend Shibley that this made him anxious. Now, I can only imagine. He was in the heart of the old Confederacy, in a state where between 1882 and 1945, more than 750 people were lynched. He was the only black person in what was then an all-white church. He was by himself. The previous Sunday, members of another congregation had made their commitment to segregation quite clear to him by standing in front of the church so he could not enter. I cannot really imagine what was going through his mind. But letting him know he was not welcome was not the intention of the young couple. Their names were Saul and Thelma Meltzer, and they were the kind of people that we sometimes call pillars of the congregation. They served in lots of volunteer roles, gave a generous pledge, and many people knew who they were and respected their opinions. Lavenal thought that they were coming over to him to tell him to leave. Instead, he related how they sat down and assured him that he was welcome. Now, knowing how congregations work, I can assure you that this was a big deal. In 1954, in the segregated South, the Meltzers, pillars of the congregation, were essentially letting everybody else know that Lavenal was under their protection, and if they were going to mess with him, they were going to have to mess with them. A few Sundays later, he joined the congregation, and his presence made it possible for a few weeks after that the first African American family to enter into our religious education program. The names of Felicia Rashad, Debbie Allen, and Tex Allen, and their mother, Vivian Allen, are likely familiar to many of you. They found a religious home here because Lavenal, Sol, and Thelma were able to form a friendship within the walls of our sanctuary more than a decade before the legal collapse of Jim Crow. The three of them remained close friends and loyal to this congregation until they went the way of all flesh. And Reverend Shibley liked to share their story and what it meant to the congregation every so often. I think for him it represented the spirit of our community, our commitment to widening Love's Circle at its best. We're going to come back to that story at the end of the sermon. For now, I want to return to the proposed eighth principle and, frankly, do a little bit of denominational business. This is not the sort of thing I particularly like to do on Sunday mornings, but it is important. If we're serious about our commitment to the democratic process, it's necessary that members of the community be informed about big changes that are afoot within our religious association. The eighth principle was launched as an effort to make our commitment to anti-racism explicit. However, a couple of years after it was launched, the Unitarian Universalist Association decided to initiate something called the Article 2 Study Commission, which some of you have probably heard about. Article 2 is where the existing principles of the association reside. The commission is charged with revising this text, which, in its members' words, is the foundation of all of the work of our UUA and member congregations. The proposed revisions will claim that the purpose of our association is to transform the world through liberating love. It will replace the existing principles with 7 shared values. It will substitute the 6 sources, which are each distinct, with a more general statement about the sources which ground us and sustain us in ordinary, difficult, and joyous times. The revision to Article 2 will include the intention behind the 8th principle in its value of justice. The text describing that value contains sentences that read, "We work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved communities where all thrive. We covenant to dismantle racism and all forms of systematic oppression." Paula Cole-Jones, it should be noted, is also on the Article 2 Study Commission. She's not just a force behind the 8th principle. And I suspect that she played a significant role in the words that have gone in to describe the shared value of justice. Now, the revisions to Article 2 will be considered at this year's General Assembly. That's the meeting that takes place each June that gathers together delegates from all the 1,000 or so Unitarian Universalist congregations in North America, well, in the United States. This year, delegates will be voting whether or not to put the revisions of Article 2 up for a year of study. Then at next year's Assembly, delegates will vote whether or not to incorporate the revisions to Article 2 into the association's bylaws. Our congregation has 6 lay delegates and ministerial delegates as well. The proposed revisions to Article 2 have been circulated in various formats, and I hope that you've had a chance to read them. There are still two opportunities to change the text if you are unsatisfied with it. First, delegates can put forth amendments until June 5th for consideration to this year's General Assembly. And if you're interested in doing that, please contact Board President Ron Cookston. He can connect you with a delegate. Second, next year, congregations, but not individuals, will have the opportunity to make amendments to whatever text is passed at this year's General Assembly, assuming a revision is passed at all. To that end, I've asked members of the board to call for a special congregational meeting in early November so that we can collectively decide whether or not the proposed changes of the revised version of Article 2 speak to us. Like I said, that's far more focus on the institutional life of the Unitarian Universalist Association than I like to offer on a Sunday morning. But given the potential impact to our community of the changes being proposed, it's important to offer some sort of overview of how the changes will be made. That means if you want to have your voice heard, there is an opportunity for you to have it heard. Of course, these proposed changes to Article 2 raise the question, why are we even considering the 8th principle in the first place? Isn't it going to just be superseded by Article 2? Now, to my thinking, there are at least 3 reasons why we should consider the 8th principle. First, and perhaps most obviously, it's going to be a year before the revisions of Article 2 take place. We should not wait another year to make clear our commitment to anti-racism. We live in a state whose political leadership is seeking to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion from public universities. We live in a country where a man can be lynched on a train, for that is exactly what happened to Jordan Neely, and the man who lynched him can receive over $2 million in donations to fund his legal defense. We live at a time where white supremacists are trying to reassert their dominance over a multiracial society. It is important to be clear about our commitments. Second, there's no guarantee that proposed revisions to Article 2 will pass. If they do not, then there will continue to be a need to incorporate something like the eighth principle into our current principles. Third, if we choose to adopt the eighth principle as a congregation, we'll be making a statement about our values as a religious tradition or institution and what it means to be part of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. Now, I recognize I just used a word that makes many Unitarian Universalists blush, institution. Many of us like to think of ourselves as individuals first and members of communities and stewards of institutions second. In some periods of this congregation's history, that pattern has been so pronounced that the former minister, Reverend Webster Kitchell, observed that in the 1960s, attacks on authority became a holy cause. He was commenting on the period of time when Horace Westwood led the congregation to desegregate. And in recent years, we have tried to move towards more collaborative models of ministry, where the ministry is shared between the congregation and the ministers. But whatever the case, we have this congregation so that we might have a place where we can come together to deepen our spiritual lives, mark life's passages, and bring some more justice into the world. Religious institutions that we form are carriers of vessels for our spiritual lives. The institutional life, the structure of the church, our principle is describing it. The vision, the mission, the covenant, the principles of governance, the financial support that members give, all these things make our life together possible. Incorporating the eighth principle into our institutional life will make clear what kind of religious community we intend to become. We'll be stating that we aspire to be an intentionally multicultural and multiracial community committed to dismantling racism and white supremacy. Now, I know that there are some people who believe it is not necessary to make such an explicit commitment. Our anti-racist intentions can be clearly found in the first principle of our Unitarian Universalist Association. It calls for us to honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person. They are spelled out in our other principles as well. The second principle, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, should also challenge us to make a commitment to anti-racism. And the third, well, truthfully, it would become a tedious exercise to read each of the existing 7 principles and describe how they call on us to engage in the difficult work of building a racially just society. But here I return to the story of Lavenel, Henderson, Soule, and Thelma Meltzer, and the Allen family. This community takes it as a point of pride that we were the first historically white church to desegregate in the city. In celebrating that story, perhaps we need to consider why we needed to desegregate in the first place. 10% of the congregation walked out the door shortly after Lavenel walked in. And I think the question needs to be asked, why did that 10% feel comfortable here in the first place? In 1954, the Universalist Church of America, one of the predecessor organizations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, had as one of its statements of faith the supreme worth of every human personality. Unitarians throughout the country could be found making similar claims, which is one of the reasons why the Unitarians and the Universalists consolidated into a single denomination in 1961. And yet, despite the presence of something like the first principle amongst our religious communion, in 1954, 10% of the congregation felt that there was no contradiction between being a Unitarian and being an opponent of civil rights and desegregation. They felt that it was possible to be members of this faith community and committed to white supremacy. And they were not alone. People like me like to celebrate Unitarian Universalism's long commitment to building the beloved community and widening the circle of love. We preachers honor the abolitionists and activists from our tradition. We remark that Frederick Douglass, at the end of his life, regularly attended All Souls in Washington, D.C. We share the story of how much of the money that came to fund John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry came from Unitarian pulpits up in Massachusetts. We memorialize our martyrs to the civil rights movement, the Reverend James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, who were killed in Selma, and those people who, like the Reverend Horace Westwood, marched in some cases many, many times with the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. We uplift the fact that we are the first tradition in North America to ordain women way back in the 1850s, to have lesbians and gays openly serving in our churches in the early 1970s, and to ordain transgender people in 1988. But we rarely speak about another truth. For generations, open white supremacists found no contradiction between Unitarianism or Universalism. John Calhoun was the Vice President of the United States. His commitment to white supremacy was so pronounced that the historian Richard Hofstadter once named him the Marx of the master class. He was a Unitarian. So was Lothrop Stoddard, whose vile books from the first part of the 20th century continue to provide much of the architecture for contemporary white supremacist thought. Tucker Carlson's Great Replacement owes a big debt to him. There was a Universalist minister who was a leader of the Ku Klux Klan, and the founder of the Klan wrote approvingly of Unitarianism and idolized Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, you might argue that devotees of that part of our tradition walked out the door in 1954 when Lavenel, Sol, and Thelma became friends. And I would hope that you would be right. But of course, the story does not end there. While First Unitarian Universalist desegregated in 1954, it has never truly become a multiracial church. Yes, we've always had African American members, but the diversity of the congregation has never come anywhere close to mirroring that of the city. As I shared with you back in February, there is a clue about why this has been the case in our archives. For in July 1954, a month after the congregational vote, the board president wrote Reverend Westwood a letter. In it, the board president's name was William Gray, reports that members of the youth group had made some friends with kids over in one of the African American Methodist churches in the Fourth Ward. The youth group wanted to go over to their friend's church and share with them one Sunday about what is the nature of Unitarianism and the meaning of our resolution. Now, the board president assured Reverend Westwood that he had discouraged the leader of the youth group who approached him. Mr. Gray told the young man such an action would be in the nature of proselytizing, and that it was counter to the spirit of the resolution. This congregation's decision to desegregate did not mean, in his words, that we were going to go out looking for African American converts. Reverend Westwood apparently concurred with the board president. He took no action to reach out to the black community. Yes, he might welcome people like Lavenel and the Allen family when they walked in the door, but he was not about to devote his energy to building a truly multiracial church. Now, it might have been that losing 10% of the membership and suffering from their bile had taken a toll. It might have been that he was not really truly able to envisioning what widening love's circle would look like. Maybe he and Mr. Gray were simply prisoners of their time, only able to do so much and see so far, just as we are bound by ours. And they were only willing to do so much to oppose the segregationist South. I don't know. But what I know is this. Adopting the eighth principle as a congregation will challenge the board, and it will challenge me to make different decisions. It will explicitly commit the congregation, and by extension the congregation's leadership, to building an anti-racist and multiracial church. When we're making decisions about how to do outreach or to think about the congregation's budget or directions for programs or staffing, we will have to ask ourselves, how are we holding ourselves accountable to the eighth principle? And we'll know that members of the congregation will do the same. In this difficult hour when resurgent white supremacy is troubling the nation, there is little work that I think could be more important. There is little work that could be more transformational. And there is little that we could do to better honor the spirits of Lavenel Henderson and Sol and Thelma Metzer. All those years ago, they helped this congregation start on a journey to become an anti-racist community devoted to widening the circle of love for all. That we might continue their journey, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.
And now I invite you to open your hymnals, the gray ones, to number 18, What Wondrous Love. Please rise in body or spirit and join together as we sing.
Please join me in reading the words on your laminated sheet for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Let us leave this place ever more committed to the work of uplifting justice, anti-racism, and transforming the world. May wondrous love move within us even when our spirits are sinking down, so that we might each do our part to build the beloved community. Go in peace, go in love. May our lives be a blessing. Amen. Thank you so much for watching our service today. We're glad you're part of our online community, where we welcome people who are diverse in faith, ethnicity, history, as well as gender identity and sexual orientation. There are many different ways you can get involved in our community. One you can do right now is by clicking like below or subscribing to our channel. If you're interested in joining our congregation, please email us at membership@firstuuhouston.org. Thanks so much for joining us.